Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 13 running back rankings for the 2022 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, we're covering all topics related to the running back position, beginning with waiver wire. Yesterday, we had our weekly waiver wire episode, but based on what happened last night with Najee Harris between the Pittsburgh Steelers and Indianapolis Colts Monday Night Football game, where Najee Harris did not participate in the second half due to an abdomen injury, it does present some questions as to where Benny Snell lies within the waiver wire rankings. We'll talk about that. We'll even talk about Jelani Woods and where he lies into potentially going after him as a tight end option for future weeks. After we talk about waiver wires, then we'll transition into talking about Week 13 matchups at the running back position, as we'll give you guys more transparency as to which defenses have been giving up the most points to opposing running backs between Week 7 through 12 in order to give you a better perspective as to which of these running backs we absolutely need to play going into Week 13 in order to set ourselves up for success in order to try to get to our fantasy playoffs. After that, we'll talk about our top 36 running back rankings. Of course, you can see our top 18 on screen, but then we'll transition to the number 19 through 36 rankings. If you guys are looking for a specific player, there are timestamps down in the description of the video with the corresponding name next to said player. Again, while you're down there in the description, if you guys haven't yet already and you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe. Again, we're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2022 season, not only trying to help you win your weekly matchups with the rankings videos, strength of schedule videos, trade target videos, rest of season rankings videos, Sunday morning live streams, all of that put together in order to help you on a weekly basis, but of course help you capture a 2022 fantasy football championship when it's all said and done. So if you have not yet already, be sure to subscribe. Also, while you're down in the description, be sure to check out Prize Picks. Throughout the course of today's video, I will be mentioning a couple Prize Pick entries in regards to some of these players that I'm really excited about going into the week. If you guys haven't checked them out already, there's a link down in the description. If you go ahead, click their link, of course, check them out and use promo code Andrew. When you sign up and make that first-time deposit, your first-time deposit is immediately doubled up to $100. Check that out today. Thank you very much. All right, let's talk about waiver wires going into Week 13. First and foremost, let's talk about the Najee Harris injury. Did not participate in the second half with an abdomen injury. Everything that I have heard is that it could potentially be an abdomen strain and or a sports hernia. Neither of those, bode well potentially for Najee Harris if they are on the more serious side. It could end up being multiple weeks, if not IR, and the rest of his season is done. If that's going to be the case, based on what we saw last night, Benny Snell seems to be the guy that we would want to go after. Like I mentioned in yesterday's waiver wire episode, you want to make sure that you have all of your handcuffs on roster when we get to the fantasy playoffs, because if in fact an injury is to occur and you don't have waiver priority and or fab, you will be in a very difficult situation if you don't have enough running back depth to be able to take on said injuries and still be able to put forth a fantastic effort within fantasy points with the remaining running backs that you have on roster. So you always want to have your handcuffs. Jaylen Warren, of course, is still dealing with that hamstring injury. He could return, only time will tell, but it's going to be between Jaylen Warren and or Benny Snell. Benny Snell looked really good last night in the attempts that he was given. Hyper efficient, found the end zone late in that fourth quarter, and to be totally honest, in my mind, would be the front runner amongst all those options. So if we're going to go ahead and pick one, it would be Benny Snell. Now, between him and Zonovan Knight, the New York Jets running back, it's still a matter of figuring out how long we're going to see Michael Carter miss. So in my mind, with James Robinson still looming in that Jets conversation, I'm leaning towards the idea that Benny Snell could be a better option going into this week specifically, but for the remainder of the season, it's most likely in favor of someone like Zonovan Knight rather than Benny Snell, because Jaylen Warren will eventually return and mix up this entire backfield into some sort of rotation. Now, before we move on and talk about matchups at the running back position, I also want to mention Jelani Woods. Last night had a great performance in terms of a rookie tight end. There have been, a couple explosive plays from him this season already, but the volume of targets in which he garnered last night was apparent that they're going to potentially continue to use him. As a run blocker, he is lousy. Now, it really wasn't his fault that, on that 3rd down and 3 play, they didn't call a timeout and they ran the ball. And of course, the defender crossed his face and made a play in the backfield on Jonathan Taylor, but he doesn't have to be a blocker. All he has to do is catch the ball on a weekly basis, and hopefully, as an option, considering how thin the tight end position is, could be a play that you might want to be going after. All right, let's move on and let's talk about matchups going into Week 13, beginning with the entire wide spectrum of how many points defenses have allowed to opposing running backs thus far this season on average in a half PPR scoring format between weeks 7 through 12. As you can see on screen, the Las Vegas Raiders continue to give up the most points on a per weekly basis, followed by the Seahawks, Houston Texans, and Green Bay Packers. Of course, they're giving up a lot of points, and we obviously want to take care of said matchups. Austin Ekeler takes on the Raiders. The Seattle Seahawks, Even though we don't have 100% confirmation as to whether or not Matthew Stafford is playing, Kyren Williams seems to be a guy that we can absolutely trust to be at least be an RB3 option within the given week. We have guys like, of course, Nick Chubb, Kareem Hunt having an advantage going up against the Houston Texans this week. Should be absolute monster plays given the amount of success that the Houston Texans have allowed to opposing running backs all season long, much less in the last 5-6 weeks here. Either way, on the other end of the spectrum, we always talk about how many points defenses are giving up to opposing running backs. But in order to give ourselves a little bit more of a defined look as to what we can expect in a given week, we have to isolate rushing statistics alone. Like I've talked about, rushing statistics are the only determining factor when we talk about running back matchups. Receiving yards based on matchups is non-existent. It's only a matter of whether that team wants to utilize a running back in the receiving game as to their potential upside and or success. Matchups do not matter. So when we isolate rushing statistics, rushing yards and rushing touchdowns, we find that, of course, the Houston Texans, Los Angeles Chargers, New York Giants, those are the best matchups in the given week, followed by, on the other end of the spectrum, specifically the teams that we want to avoid on a weekly basis: Baltimore, San Francisco, New England, Washington, and Tennessee. And we know that every single running back that comes in, contact with these defenses typically does not find much success unless a touchdown is going to accompany their performance. Either way, just keeping that in mind, we will refer back to these statistics over the course of today's video in terms of talking about potential matchups. But either way, hopefully you guys appreciate this information. Be sure to click the like button down below. Let's get into talking about our top 36 running back rankings for week 13 of the 2022 fantasy football season, beginning with our number one. We have Josh Jacobs. It is a given. And it's not because Josh Jacobs currently is the number one RB in a half PPR in terms of fantasy football. It's because I truly do believe going up against the division rival, the Los Angeles Chargers, it's one of the easiest matchups at the position, and that's a given. Besides the fact that last week, Josh Jacobs gave many of us a scare. On Friday, popped up on the injury report with a calf injury. It wasn't a matter of determining whether he was going to play. We knew he was going to play. He's always been a tough guy. But it was going to be a matter of which volume he was going to play. Next thing you know, the guy gets 40 opportunities and 39 total touches on Sunday and has the second best performance of a running back this season in fantasy and has the most rushing yards by a running back this season in fantasy. An unbelievable performance, a season-defining performance that going forward, hopefully the momentum continues. And it certainly will this week against the LA Chargers, who have given up a boatload of points. On a per-weekly basis in terms of running back rushing statistics alone, they're giving up 21.42 per week since week 7. That is an unbelievable statistic. Just talking about last week's performance against Arizona. James Conner, for the first time since 2020, surpassed 100 rushing yards. I mean, the last time he surpassed it, he was on the Pittsburgh Steelers. That's how incredible this matchup is for running backs. Not only that, KC combined for 140 against them. San Francisco, 127 and a touchdown. Atlanta, 177 and 2 touchdowns. Seattle, 202 and 2 touchdowns. This all bodes really well for the potential of Josh Jacobs. And going into this week via Prize Picks, his current number is 85.5 rushing yards. Like I talked about in weeks past, specifically last week I mentioned this. Since 2020, when Josh Jacobs surpasses 80 rushing yards, this team is 12-1 in terms of a win-to-loss record. They want to hand him the ball. They will continue to do so. And of course, they may end up winning this game, though a lot of people aren't expecting them to do so. And obviously, we're taking them more via that number on Prize Picks this week. Moving on to our number 2, we have Nick Chubb. Again, Nick Chubb is a fantastic player, and he has an incredible matchup. Coming off of a week in overtime in which he scored the game-winning touchdown against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Fantastic. Both these guys won in overtime with them finding the end zone. And now that they get into a conversation in week 13 where they both have two of the best matchups you can possibly ask for, automatic success should be around the corner. Now, we have Deshaun Watson probably playing under center for the Cleveland Browns, which will mean a little bit of that kind of acclimation period, which probably leans them towards running the ball even more going into the week. Specifically, when we talk about the running back position in the NFL, Nick Chubb thus far this season is number one amongst all running backs in terms of rushing statistics averaged per game. He averages currently 15.99 rushing statistics per game. Number one amongst all running backs. And he takes on a defense that is allowing the most rushing statistics per week since week 7, which is 24.4, the Houston Texans. An automatic matchup going into this week. Prize Picks has him at 90.5, assuming they don't just blow out this defense in the first half, similar to the way that the Miami Dolphins did. I expect the Cleveland Browns to run the ball heavily with Nick Chubb and for him to absolutely crush this number of 90.5 rushing yards. Moving on to our number 3, we have Austin Ekeler. Of course, he takes on the Las Vegas Raiders. And the Las Vegas Raiders, they're giving up their fair share of points to opposing running backs. I mean, just over the course of the last couple weeks, Kamara, 38.3, Etienne, 25.6, Jonathan Taylor, 23.3, Latavius Murray, 15.2, and just this last week, Kenneth Walker, 16.4. 15 plus fantasy points to the last 5 consecutive running backs that they've played against. So Austin Ekeler obviously in a fantastic position to succeed. He's had himself a great season thus far. But the only reason that we may be a little bit hesitant on Austin Ekeler is mainly because he hasn't been running the ball as much. Quite frankly, I'd like to see him run the ball less. Don't give him those opportunities unless they're on the goal line. Continue to get him the ball in the receiving game. Because receptions at a capacity of 15 targets that led to 11 receptions this last week are significantly more valuable in terms of fantasy point production per touch. So going forward, as long as they continue to get him utilized in the receiving game, should be a fantastic option. Mainly the reason why he ran the ball less this last week had to do with game script. Of course, the Arizona Cardinals took a lead early. They were up 10 points. And of course, Corey Linsley, their all-pro center, was dealing with an injury and exited that game. With a lot of offensive linemen down, it's definitely a lot more difficult for them to run the ball, and they continue to pass the ball in the direction of Austin Ekeler, which will continue to succeed. Moving on to Jonathan Taylor. If it wasn't for the fact that handoff was fumbled on the 1-yard line, Jonathan Taylor finishes last night's game with 23.3 fantasy points. Quite frankly, that is a objective truth. Maybe even more points. You never know. But ultimately, Jonathan Taylor had himself a situation there where he could have had himself a second touchdown. But over the last 3 consecutive weeks, since Jeff Saturday has joined this organization, Jonathan Taylor has had 3 consecutive games of 20 or more rushing attempts and 1 rushing touchdown. And if we're going to continue to get him more and more opportunities every single week, he's the best facet of that offense. They have to stop throwing as much as they do, quite frankly, and they need to get the ball in his hands. Taking on the Dallas Cowboys may seem like a difficult matchup, but over the course of the last month, the Dallas Cowboys have been one of those matchups we absolutely want to take advantage of. Going into this week, again, I expect to see Jonathan Taylor with another week of 20-plus rushing attempts, another week of a rushing touchdown, and everything in terms of the reception game, the receiving game, and of course the rushing yard game is just going to be bonus points for us on a weekly basis. Moving on to Derrick Henry, our number 5. Derrick Henry's coming off of a week in which he was shut down just exclusively. Now, that being said, besides the rushing production not finding, much success, 17 attempts for 38 yards, he should have had himself a touchdown. Similar to Jonathan Taylor, they both ended up fumbling very close to the goal line, and it was only 4 yards for Derrick Henry getting a 6-point influx in his fantasy point production, going from 13.2 half PPR points to 19.2. Would have been an incredible overall week, but unfortunately, fumbled. Treylon Burks recovered it in the end zone. Overall, we do expect him to find a lot of success this week, mainly because of the matchup against the Philadelphia Eagles. The Philadelphia Eagles over the course of the last couple weeks, just giving you some ideas as to how many rushing yards they've allowed. To Houston, 148. Washington, 130. Indianapolis, 98 and a touchdown. Green Bay, 107 and a touchdown. Even in that Washington game, they gave up 2 touchdowns. They have been giving up a bunch of yards on the ground, and teams have typically, over the course of this season, learned that the way to beat the Philadelphia Eagles is to keep the ball out of Jalen Hurts' hands. And how do you do that? You milk clock by running the ball. And out of all the teams to do so and be tasked with that goal this week, Derrick Henry's in a perfect spot to succeed. Moving on to Aaron Jones, our number 6, takes on the Chicago Bears. It is a very advantageous matchup. Earlier this season in week 2, going up against that defense, we saw a lot of success from Aaron Jones, even when Roquan Smith was the middle backer of that team. He's now gone. He's been traded to the Baltimore Ravens, which makes it that much of an easier task for them to run the ball. In that game, Aaron Jones, 15 attempts for 132 and a touchdown, 3 catches on 3 targets, 38 yards and a touchdown, 30.5 fantasy points in week 2 against Chicago. Why not another big performance here from Aaron Jones, who is coming off of consecutive games of big performances outside of that one injury that he left the game with? Overall, we're in a position where Aaron Jones is back on track, scoring touchdowns, and quite frankly, even being used as a vertical threat in the receiving game. Earlier today, we got confirmation from Aaron Rodgers himself via the Pat McAfee show that he is going to be, playing this week. He got good news via the MRI. He's good to go. He's going to be suiting up. That definitely helps the potential of this offense, stretch defenses, and going up against Chicago, who over the course of the last couple weeks, since week 8, has given up 152 and a touchdown to the New York Jets, 111 to Atlanta, 79 and 2 touchdowns to Detroit, 77 and a touchdown to Miami, and 154 and 3 touchdowns to Dallas. Incredible performances across the board. They're going to have their hands full with Aaron Jones and, of course, A.J. Dillon. Moving on to Rhamondre Stevenson, our number 7. He plays on Thursday Night Football. And the expectation is that Dameon Harris, the backup running back for this team, is not going to be active. The last time we saw him, last Thursday night, he was, leaving the game on crutches out of the locker room. So with him not active, Rhamondre Stevenson gets the entire reign of this backfield. And with that much volume of opportunity, expect a lot of success. And you may be wondering, Andrew, is that success going to come on the ground? It could. Of course, running the ball on the Buffalo Bills has been an advantageous position for teams over the course of the last month here. But quite frankly, where Rhamondre Stevenson has defined himself in terms of fantasy this year has been in the receiving role. Prior to the start of the season beginning, you guys remember the reports? We talked about it, where there was reports out of the New England Patriots camp that they're going to utilize him like James White. And what have they done? They've done exactly that. In the last 5 weeks, he has had 38 targets that have led to 33 receptions. In the last 9 games, he's put up 9 consecutive weeks of 10 or more fantasy points. He's in a fantastic position to succeed on Thursday night against Buffalo. His current number via PrizePicks, not in the rushing category, but in terms of receiving yards, is 31.5. Been able to surpass that in 4 out of the last 5 games with the volume of receptions he's continuing to get. Should be an automatic play. Moving on to Joe Mixon on number 8. Joe Mixon, of course, coming off of a week in which he did not participate, obviously was in the concussion protocol, and Samaje Perine stepped up in week 12 with 17 carries for 58 yards and a touchdown, 7 total targets, 4 catches, 35 yards. If you guys remember what I was projecting Samaje Perine at during the weekend, I said, hey, if he doesn't score a touchdown, he gets about 12 points, 5 catches for 35 yards, probably gets himself 44 rushing yards because that was the average in which Tennessee was allowing. If he scores a touchdown, he gets to the 18-point mark. He put up 17.4. The projection was pretty much in line, and the fact of the matter was, the Cincinnati Bengals running attack, their offensive line in specific, were playing far better than we had seen earlier in the season, especially tasked with going up against the Tennessee Titans defense, which again, is one of the best in the league at stopping the run. Now this week they take on the Kansas City Chiefs, and Joe Mixon has his own experience against this team, once in the regular season in 2021, and once in the playoffs last year, in which he took them on. In both scenarios, was given a high volume of opportunity. In one game, 20 total opportunities, the other, 24. He put up 13.0 fantasy points in one game and 12.1 in the other without scoring a touchdown in either game. If he goes ahead and has a similar performance of 12, 13 fantasy points, accompanies that with a touchdown, we're talking about an 18 to 19 point running back within this given week against the matchup, which of course, typically you find success when you run the ball heavily against the Kansas City Chiefs. Hopefully Joe Mixon will be able to get it done on the ground and through the air. Moving on to Christian McCaffrey on number 9. Christian McCaffrey is currently dealing with quote unquote knee irritation. That is the quote that Kyle Shanahan has given the media, and we're going to run with that. Obviously, we know that Elijah Mitchell is probably going to miss 6 to 8 weeks. He is done for the season, and there is rumors that Tevin Coleman may be re-signed to the organization in order to utilize him this week up against the Miami Dolphins. We're going to have to wait and see as to whether that's going to be the case in terms of potential waiver wire purposes. But at this current moment, Christian McCaffrey, if you're healthy and you're active, should be a great play. Unfortunately, over the course of the last couple weeks, in terms of his rushing potential, he's been quite inefficient in the rushing attempts he's been given. I think they should just use him purely like Ekeler. Do not get him rushing attempts, pass the ball the entire game, and dump it off to him, because that is where the value is on a weekly basis. Now, when you're taking on the Miami Dolphins defense, since week 7, they've only been allowing 58.2 rushing yards per game to opposing running backs and a 3.51 yard per carry average, which has pretty much been a little bit even better than what Christian McCaffrey has produced over the course of the last couple weeks here. So at this current moment in time, in order for Christian McCaffrey to be a relevant fantasy option within the given matchup, we're absolutely going to have to rely upon touchdown upside and receiving upside for him to make his week. Moving on to Dalvin Cook on number 10. Dalvin Cook had 2 opportunities last week of scoring a touchdown. In 2 different circumstances, he fell short of a touchdown on the 1 yard line. If in fact he falls into the end zone, he takes his 7.6, underwhelming fantasy performance and turns that into a double-digit performance where we're quite frankly not even complaining about it. We'll take that up against New England. Now, this last week is coming off of a week in which he had a season-high 22 rushing attempts. Yes, he was quite inefficient with only 42 rushing yards, but he also had himself 4 catches on 5 total targets. Another week here, over the course of the last 5 weeks here, 4 out of the last 5 weeks, 5 or more targets. With more of a conscious effort from this offense and the offensive coordinator to get him the ball in the receiving game, we're absolutely going to see his overall baseline of production increase. With Christian Darrisaw potentially returning this week, I'm expecting a lot of production from Dalvin Cook up against the New York Jets defense that typically teams don't want to throw against, but they'll be able to succeed on the ground, I can assure you that. Moving on to Travis Etienne on number 11. Like we talked about on Monday's waiver wire episode, the expectation is that Travis Etienne is healthy. He was cleared to come back in the game. Coach Doug Peterson, potentially the head medical staff, did not want to risk it, so they went ahead and held him out. Again, they're not playing for a playoff spot, so they wanted to go ahead and ensure that Travis Etienne was ready to go for the remainder of the season. At this current moment in time, we're probably in a position up against the Detroit Lions in which he should find success. Again, even though this offensive line hasn't played incredible this season, Travis Etienne by himself has been the biggest difference maker in terms of making plays with his own legs, making defenders miss, and being a fantastic fantasy option. Now, even though we saw JaMychal Hasty be a huge part of the receiving game, totaling 5 total receptions on 5 targets, 67 yards and a receiving touchdown, we're typically not going to see that from Travis Etienne. We haven't seen that all season long. And as of this current moment in time, even if they limit his overall potential touches, I still think he's got RB1 upside within the given week up against Detroit. Moving on to Saquon Barkley. Speaking of RB1s, Saquon Barkley, On Thursday against the Dallas Cowboys, I expected him not to play as well as he did. Quite frankly, I had him lower ranked. Putting up 13.2 fantasy points was a fantastic week, mainly saved by the touchdown because 11 rushing attempts for 39 yards and only 4 catches for 13 yards wasn't going to get the job done, mainly because 4 of his offensive linemen were out. You got to remember, it was a short week going from Sunday to Thursday on that Thanksgiving Day game. And with 4 offensive linemen out, they still managed to put together a good performance as an offense as a whole. So if Saquon Barkley is going to be in a position where his offensive line is a little bit healthier this week, he's certainly going to need it going up against the Washington Commanders, who have been one of the best defenses in terms of stopping the run. Even though they have been fantastic, just this last week, Atlanta's running backs combined for 118 rushing yards. If, in fact, we get a healthy offensive line here for Saquon Barkley and a couple burst runs, we could see a fantastic week, assuming he falls into the end zone. Moving on to David Montgomery, our number 13. Whether or not we do see the activation of Justin Fields going into this weekend's game, I still think David Montgomery is going to find success. The Green Bay Packers have been one of the worst defenses in terms of stopping the run. With Devondre Campbell still out, it continues to be a complete mess in terms of being able to just stop opposing running backs on a downly basis. I mean, we just saw Miles Sanders tear apart this defense. The running back position as a whole from Philadelphia combined for 32 carries, 206 rushing yards, and 3 rushing touchdowns. Unbelievable performances we have seen over the last 3 weeks. Even the week prior, we saw Derrick Henry get himself over 80 rushing yards, have himself a rushing touchdown and a passing touchdown. The week prior, the Dallas Cowboys running backs, 153 rushing yards and a touchdown against this defense. Incredible performances across the board. David Montgomery, the last time he took on the Green Bay Packers in week 2, 15 carries for 122 rushing yards, 14.6 fantasy points, while he also got himself a little bit of utilization in the receiving game. Whether it's with or without Justin Fields, I'm expecting a lot of success from David Montgomery. Moving on to Jamaal Williams. Jamaal Williams has just been consistent. That has purely been the case. Since DeAndre Swift has returned in that Miami game just a couple weeks back, we have continued to see Jamaal Williams dominate the running workload. Sure, so DeAndre Swift is going to be the receiving back of this team. That's perfectly fine. But what Jamaal Williams has done in comparison to DeAndre Swift over the course of the last couple weeks, 85 rushing attempts for 323 rushing yards and 7 rushing touchdowns in comparison to Swift, who has only had 23 rushing attempts, 61 rushing yards, and 2 rushing touchdowns. The hyper inefficiency of DeAndre Swift, his health concerns, and the fact that this offensive coordinator and coaching staff do not want to get him more utilization continues to lead us in the direction of absolutely playing Jamaal Williams. Currently this week, takes on the Jacksonville Jaguars. His current number on PrizePicks, 60.5 rushing yards. An automatic play in my eyes. Needs to go ahead and been taken advantage of easily this week. Put an entry in alongside Nick Chubb and Josh Jacobs. I've already done so. We'll continue to try to look for more as the week progresses. But as of this current moment in time, against Jacksonville's defense of all defenses, we just saw a guy like Gus Edwards come back from injury and immediately find success in the end zone. So will Jamaal Williams. Moving on to Kenneth Walker III. Kenneth Walker is in a pretty tough situation. The last 2 weeks, this running attack has been nullified effectively. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers and the Las Vegas Raiders have shut them down. Yet, Kenneth Walker still found the end zone this last week. Got him still, 16.4 fantasy points due to the 12-point influx of touchdowns. But going forward, hopefully we're going to see a situation where against the LA Rams, which is a pretty tough run-stopping defense, we can continue to find success. The current injury news in regards to this game has to do with Aaron Donald. Aaron Donald is currently being looked at, dealing with an injury. We don't know exactly what extent it is going to be and whether or not he's going to even play. If he ends up missing this week, it makes it that much easier for this rushing attack to be a relevant option. We know that the passing game is going to work. Geno Smith has been extremely consistent in that factor, and so have the 2 primary receiving options of Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf. So going forward, as long as those 2 guys are going to tear up that secondary, which they certainly will, the LA Rams give up their fair share of points to opposing wide receivers. Eventually, the goal line game will be there for Kenneth Walker. We're just hoping that the yardage can accompany a pretty big game there as well. Moving on to Ezekiel Elliott, our number 16. I have to respect the performances. It is just what it is. Ezekiel Elliott has had himself incredible performances in his last 4 games. Let me give you some perspective. In the last 4 games that he has played, 15.1, 17.7, 17.2, 16.0. Those are his half PPR contributions. Over 15 fantasy points in the last 4 consecutive games. He's been able to get himself 14 plus touches and a singular touchdown in all 4 of those games. With this being the case, Ezekiel Elliott earns my respect. And as the primary goal line back, and even though he's not out carrying Tony Pollard in these given weeks, quite frankly, he's associated with an offense that has the 8th most touchdowns as an offense this season amongst all 32 teams. And they have the 4th most touchdowns amongst rushing touchdowns amongst all teams in the National Football League. In this current position, Ezekiel Elliott going up against the Indianapolis Colts, in my mind, is an automatic play. Moving on to Miles Sanders, our number 17. Miles Sanders coming off an explosive performance. Let's not get this twisted. He is coming off of a game in which we won't often see from Miles Sanders. I mean, the guy quite literally has himself 8 rushing touchdowns this year. He's the 6th highest amongst all running backs in the National Football League. Remember last year when he had 0? It's pretty much completely changed the entire script. When you have a situation where you're giving him opportunities down on the goal line, he's going to be able to deliver. Obviously, his receiving upside doesn't exist, so going up against the Tennessee Titans is going to be tough. It definitely is going to be. But when we're talking about one of the best offensive lines in the National Football League, a running back that currently has the 2nd highest number in terms of yards before contact per attempt, only behind active running back Jeff Wilson in the 2022 season, currently with a 3.5 yards before contact per attempt average, Miles Sanders is in a position where he should absolutely go off. He's coming off of a week in which he had his most rushing attempts since week 4. We're in a position where Miles Sanders, even in a tough matchup against Tennessee, should be utilized at a pretty high capacity. Moving on to our number 18, the second Dallas Cowboys running back we want to talk about, of course, is Tony Pollard. Tony Pollard seems like he's not going to be given those goal line carries. Even though he has been in the place where they are making goal line opportunities, he isn't being given the ball. I mean, just go ahead and rewind to Thursday night's game against the New York Giants on Thanksgiving. Late in that game, was in on a goal line opportunity. And instead of handing it off to Tony Pollard, guess who they handed off to? A backup tight end who ran in for a touchdown. Opportunities are going to be there for Tony Pollard. Not always, because Zeke is going to be a vulture in some capacities. But if Zeke is going to play as well as he is, in terms of efficiency on the ground, he deserved those attempts. So as of right now, we're looking for Tony Pollard not only to be the guy that gets majority of the touches out of his backfield, still coming off of a week in which he had 20 total touches, but we're hoping that the home run ability of Tony Pollard on the ground through the air, and of course, the potential of him getting a couple goal line snaps here or there, potentially falling into the end zone, is definitely in the realm of possibility in this given week. Moving on, let's talk about the second half of this conversation. Before we talk about Rachaad White, if you've made it this far, be sure to subscribe to the channel, click the like button down below. Certainly does help out a lot. If you guys have any comments, questions, be sure to let me know down in the comment section. I'll be sure to look those over later today and tomorrow, obviously before the Thursday night games if you have any questions. Thank you very much. All right, let's talk about Rachaad White. So, with Leonard Fournette most likely to return this week, where does that leave Rachaad White? In my opinion, it probably, takes away some of the potential targets. We saw Rachaad White come off of a game of 9 targets, 9 receptions for 45 yards. In a full PPR, those of you who started him benefited greatly. In a regular game of a half PPR, 15.4 fantasy points. We'll take it. We obviously wanted a rushing touchdown to accompany his performance, but wasn't able to find that number. Nonetheless, at this current moment in time, he takes on the New Orleans Saints. Over the course of the last couple weeks, 92 yards to the San Francisco running backs, 106 to LA Rams running backs, 151 to Pittsburgh's running backs, and 106 and 2 touchdowns to Baltimore's. As a whole, we're going to see a lot of success from the rushing attack of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. It's just going to be a matter of how much utilization Leonard Fournette potentially steals away. If, in fact, he's going to be limited in his return, Rachaad White should be a great play. Moving on to Benny Snell. Like I was mentioning as the beginning of this episode, Benny Snell is an automatic play. Going forward, Benny Snell should be picked up and potentially played in the absence of Najee Harris, coming off of a week in which he had 12 carries, 62 yards, and a touchdown. We know that we saw Anthony McFarland get a couple, touches here and there. We know that Jaylen Warren could potentially return. But at this current moment in time, in an offense that obviously wants to continue to run the ball. I mean, in the first half of that game, Najee Harris, 10 carries, 35 yards, and a touchdown. In the second half, of course, Benny Snell dominated. As a whole, they want to give a singular running back 20 or more touches. And we know how the Pittsburgh Steelers work. They never want to split carries amongst multiple running backs over the course of an entire season. They want to establish a singular back. They have done that over the course of the last 10 years plus. Whether it's with, Najee Harris, James Conner, Le'Veon Bell, D'Angelo Williams, it doesn't matter. If they have a primary guy, they feed him majority of the carries, and they don't want to go ahead and, feed too many carries elsewhere, unless they have to because of an injury, which of course has been this season with Najee Harris. Nonetheless, I think going up against this given matchup of the Atlanta Falcons in the last 3 weeks, Brian Robinson, 19.5, David Montgomery, 19.6, Deontay Foreman, 19.0. We are in a position here where we should see a lot of success from Benny Snell. Moving on, let's talk about number 21, Jeff Wilson Jr. Jeff Wilson Jr. takes on the San Francisco 49ers, giving up quite literally 7.34 fantasy points per week since week 7 in terms of rushing statistics alone. Now, Jeff Wilson this last week should have had himself an even better performance, but unfortunately, the halftime score was quite literally 30-0. A lot of defensive touchdowns, and the fact that he was cramping led to him getting less total opportunity, only 13 rushing attempts and 1 total reception, when he honestly should have had 20 plus rushing attempts and an even better overall performance within said game. Maybe even an additional rushing touchdown on that goal line instead of, Tua dropping back, scrambling, and finding Durham Smythe in the end zone. Nonetheless, I do expect Jeff Wilson Jr. to be limited in some capacities due to the current matchup, but it is a revenge game. We should see a lot of fun between those two teams firing away. Moving on to Alvin Kamara, our number 22. I'm worried about Alvin Kamara. I'll be just plain and simple about it. Not only is he coming off of his last 4 games, 3 of them being 10 or less rushing attempts and 50 or less rushing yards, that in itself is a concern. But going forward, the fact that he's coming off of a week where he had 2 fumbles lost is really concerning. They may end up being in a position where if they're not able to capture this victory here against Tampa Bay, that they're just going to tank. They're just going to pack it in, go for a quarterback in the draft, and just close up shop for Alvin Kamara's potential future for the remainder of the season. Now, if they're able to beat the Tampa Bay Buccaneers this week, which hopefully their efforts are going to be there, and the opportunities are going to be there for Alvin Kamara, specifically in the receiving game because he hasn't scored touchdowns and he hasn't been given many rushing attempts, 7 carries for 13 yards last week, I'm a little bit hesitant on him. He is purely a guy that needs to get himself 8+ catches and a touchdown in order to be relevant, unless you're in some sort of full PPR format where you can get away with him scoring 10 fantasy points just off receiving statistics alone. At this current moment, it's really sketchy to play Alvin Kamara, but it's only a matter of time where he gets back on track. Whether it's in this given matchup, it's tough to say. Moving on to Brian Robinson. They move back and forth with Brian Robinson and Antonio Gibson, 1 week on, 1 week off. In my mind, Brian Robinson should be the primary back. Considering we still have Antonio Gibson returning kickoffs, Brian Robinson is the starting running back. Now, going into this week, the New York Giants matchup is the 3rd best in terms of running back rushing statistics allowed since week 7. Ultimately, it's going to be a matter of whether or not Brian Robinson can get an efficient amount of touches, and if so, the effectiveness of said touches will determine his given week. Now, since week 7, we have seen this New York Giants defense give up a boatload of points to opposing running backs. 120 rushing yards and a touchdown to Jacksonville backs, 61 and a touchdown to Seattle, 96 yards to Houston. We saw 150 and 4 touchdowns to Detroit running backs and 152 and 1 touchdown to Dallas running backs on Thursday night. A lot of potential there. Hopefully, Brian Robinson continues his momentum of finishing as the number 3 overall back in week 12 in a half PPR, to potentially being a top 24 option going forward, even with Antonio Gibson getting contributions. Moving on to Dameon Pierce. This is the final week for Dameon Pierce. I will leave him at the number 24 spot because in the last 2 games, he has had 15 rushing attempts for 16 yards and 5.8 fantasy points. If in fact he can contribute and deliver on a fantastic performance against the Cleveland Browns, then by all means, he is going to be able to at least garner some sort of confidence from me going forward. But at this current moment in time, I am very afraid that this offense is tanking. And with the move to Kyle Allen, they're only continuing to ensure that they're going to be in negative game scripts and probably not utilizing Dameon Pierce a lot in the second half of games, considering said game scripts. Even though I love the matchup against Cleveland, it is tough for me to objectively say that Dameon Pierce is going to get himself 15+ rushing attempts and be a fantastic option, even with the matchup on hand. Moving on to Gus Edwards, our number 25. At the current moment, we don't know if J.K. Dobbins is returning, but if in fact he does, we will probably move Gus Edwards a little bit further down, just a tad bit, but ultimately he should be still the number 1 running back in this given week. Going up against the Denver Broncos, in the last couple matchups, we have seen the Denver Broncos give up 178 rushing yards to the Carolina Panthers last week, 109 rushing yards to Las Vegas week prior to that, and of course, the Jacksonville Jaguars a couple weeks back, 169 and a touchdown. 3 out of the last 4 performances giving up over 100 rushing yards on the ground to opposing running backs. He is clearly the number 1 running back of this offense, assuming that J.K. Dobbins is not active, based on what we saw from Kenyon Drake only having 2 rushing attempts on Sunday. So in my opinion, Gus Edwards, being given the bulk majority of touches, should be in a fantastic position. Currently, his number on PrizePicks this week is 50.5 rushing yards. In the 3 total games he has played this season, he has surpassed that number every single time, and has in fact surpassed that number 5 consecutive times throughout his entire career. Should be a fantastic play and an automatic. Moving on, let's talk about Cordarrelle Patterson. He continues to split snaps with Tyler Algier, and he continues to split rushing attempts. And unless he's going to find the end zone as a specific goal line back, it's going to be tough. Now, that being said, the final play for the Atlanta Falcons as an offense was a passing attempt towards Cordarrelle Patterson. If it wasn't tipped at the line of scrimmage, Cordarrelle Patterson scores the receiving touchdown to potentially tie, if not win that game on Sunday against the Washington Commanders. Should have had himself a receiving touchdown in his scoreline. This game, he had himself 5 total targets, 3 receptions, 19 yards, was the most targets that we had seen him have since week 1. If those numbers continue to accelerate in the right direction, even with Tyler Algier getting more and more rushing opportunities, I expect to see Cordarrelle Patterson absolutely succeed this week in the matchup against Pittsburgh. Moving on to Devin Singletary. Here's the thing about Singletary. Takes on the New England Patriots on a short week on Thursday night. We could hope that he's going to get himself the opportunities that he needs, but ultimately it's not a guarantee. The thing is, Devin Singletary, in order to be an effective fantasy option, needs to score a touchdown. He has scored himself 3 touchdowns in the last 3 weeks, but unfortunately this last week against the Detroit Lions, that wasn't one of the weeks. He wasn't able to find the end zone and finished the game with 8.5 fantasy points, even though he was efficient with 72 rushing yards on 14 total rushing attempts, had himself 80 total rushing yards within the total game, 1 reception. I still think that it's a tough enough matchup to where he's not going to be utilized at a higher capacity. This is going to be a Josh Allen game. Typically is when these two teams have met in the playoffs and or the regular season. Moving on to Leonard Fournette, number 28. Again, I expect him to get utilization. I just don't expect him to come and take over the backfield immediately. Rachaad White's contributions over the course of last month have defined the role that Leonard Fournette is probably going to see. Yes, he'll get a couple early down rushing attempts, but majority of his time will be spent pass blocking, third down receiving, and then, a couple sprinkles here and there elsewhere. If in fact he's returning, I have him as an RB3. If in fact he does not return this week and he's going to miss once again, Rachaad White will get another week of establishing himself as the maintained number 1, and it'll make it that much harder for Leonard Fournette to return and take back the position that was once his. Moving on to Isiah Pacheco. Isiah Pacheco found the end zone. I kept saying it. Isiah Pacheco probably not going to find the end zone. It's tough for him to do so. And even though he was inefficient in his overall rushing opportunities, only 69 rushing yards on 22 rushing attempts, he still found himself the end zone. Now, the biggest news of yesterday was Melvin Gordon being signed. Now, if Melvin Gordon is available in your league, you can certainly pick him up, but I'm expecting Isiah Pacheco to continue to maintain as the starting running back of this team in terms of rushing attempts. Now, since week 10, since Isiah Pacheco has pretty much been given the opportunity, he has had himself 53 rushing attempts for 258 rushing yards, 1 rushing touchdown. That's a 4.87 yard per carry average. Of course, Melvin Gordon could put together numbers like that, but currently, I'm expecting Pacheco to continue to maintain this job, going up against the Cincinnati Bengals, who just shut down Derrick Henry. It's going to be tough for Pacheco, but overall, I'm expecting him to be at least a decent option. Moving on to Latavius Murray. Speaking of defenses shutting down opposing, offensive running backs, the Baltimore Ravens have been really good. And even though Latavius Murray is coming off of 2 weeks here where he's been over 10 fantasy points in both contributions, I'm expecting that Baltimore Ravens overall run-stopping defense to just nullify this offense as a whole, which will force Russell Wilson to throw more, which will make us want to play the Baltimore Ravens defense that much more in this given week. Over the course of the last 4 games, they've allowed 42 rushing yards to Jacksonville, 24 to Carolina, 37 to New Orleans, and 43 to Tampa Bay. They have not allowed more than 44 rushing yards to opposing running backs in a singular game in the last 4 weeks. This is a very difficult matchup, and I'm expecting Latavius Murray to have himself some trouble. Moving on to Antonio Gibson. Again, in the same vein of Brian Robinson's conversation that we had earlier, if the opportunities continue to fluctuate and it's going to be one or the other in a given week and we can't guess that, it's going to be tough. That being said, they have a fantastic matchup against the New York Giants, so both of them could very easily succeed. But I think with Antonio Gibson still returning kicks and still playing special teams, he is still seen as a guy that could only get more touches if the hot hand is continuing to work in that game. If he starts out slow, they'll continue to go towards Brian Robinson. If he picks up pace, they'd rather have him on the field because he has already proved that he's a better receiving back and, of course, can contribute in the pass blocking game. Moving on, let's talk about DeAndre Swift. Even though DeAndre Swift had 2 opportunities of scoring touchdowns and failed on both of them, coming 1 yard short on both opportunities, we still see him get, a decent amount of fantasy points. Got himself a 2-point conversion, 8.3 fantasy points. But like I mentioned last week, 8.3 fantasy points is not going to cover it. That's going to be, the bottom end of the RB3 conversation. Unless he finds the end zone, we're going to have ourselves a pretty tough situation here. Taking on Jacksonville is an advantageous matchup, and throughout his career, when you look at the first game in which DeAndre Swift took over the Detroit Lions backfield back in 2020, it was against the Jacksonville Jaguars after a bye week, in which he overtook Adrian Peterson and Kerryon Johnson in this backfield and became the number 1. Maybe DeAndre Swift will have himself another explosive performance against Jacksonville, mirroring his once, incredible performance back in 2020. But again, at this current moment in time, it's not much of a guarantee with Jamaal Williams being the primary running back. Moving on to Zonovan Knight. Zonovan Knight, again, is going to be someone that, in my mind, is going to be that early down back. I mean, we even saw him get early opportunity within the first drive of this game for the New York Jets. They want to utilize him. They found that This guy is obviously going to be continuously utilized within this backfield. And even with Ty Johnson getting himself a couple touches here and there, we know that Michael Carter is dealing with a potential high ankle and James Robinson's a healthy scratch. At this current moment, if we're going to continue to see Zonovan Knight not only utilized on the ground but through the air and had himself a lot of bursty runs in which they were not only for just 3 or 4 yards, a lot of 7, 8, 12-yard rushing attempts and receptions, we're going to potentially see him have another pretty good game here against Minnesota. Moving on, let's talk about Kareem Hunt. Even though I love Kareem Hunt, he is just not given enough opportunity. 5 rushing attempts for 15 yards is not going to cut it. This week, luckily, they take on, of course, the Houston Texans. There is a potential in which, even though they're going to blow out this team and put up a lot of points on the ground, Ernest Johnson may be the guy that takes a lot of those second half rushing attempts. And if, in fact, Kareem Hunt isn't given a streamlined 15-plus rushing attempts in this game, could be tough for us to trust him based on what he has shown in the last month. Moving on to A.J. Dillon. Over the course of his career in the last 3 games that he's played against the Chicago Bears in specific, 11 attempts for 59, 15 attempts for 71, and 18 attempts for 61. He's coming off of a week in which he was hyper efficient with 8 rushing attempts for 64 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown, 3 receptions and 24 receiving yards for 16.3 fantasy points. Fantastic performance out of nowhere, but of course we expected running backs to succeed against the Philadelphia Eagles defense, just not mainly A.J. Dillon. Either way, if he's going to continue to see more and more volume, his touches will, of course, lead to fantasy points. As to a touchdown, that is the ever-elusive question, and that's what makes him a lower-end option because if he doesn't score a touchdown, he gets you 5 to 6, maybe 7 points if you're lucky. Moving on to the final option I wanted to mention before we close out today's running back rankings video, it is Kyren Williams. At the current moment in time, with Matthew Stafford most likely going to be out for another consecutive week just to protect him and his health for future seasons, Kyren Williams will continue to be the primary back for this team based on the current game scripts of this team, obviously having to come back for a majority of the games, and of course not being able to be in a position where they can consistently run the ball and be efficient at doing so with Cam Akers. So Kyren Williams takes the spot, and at this current moment in time, coming off a week of 7.5 fantasy points, we could probably see another week like that where he gets 6, 7 fantasy points if we're lucky, scores a touchdown if we're completely blessed by the fantasy gods. But again, that's going to be the ever elusive. That's going to cover it for me today. Those are my top 36 running back rankings. We talked about waiver wires, matchups, running backs in specific, talking about them each individually for quite some time. I do appreciate you guys supporting the channel and, of course, taking time out of your day to watch. Again, hopefully this helped. If you have a question, let me know down in the comment section. Also, while you're down there, be sure to click the like button, subscribe if you have not yet already, and, of course, check out Prize Picks. We mentioned a lot of potential plays, whether it was Josh Jacobs, whether it was Rhamondre Stevenson, Nick Chubb, Jamaal Williams, Gus Edwards. A lot of these plays going more on their given statistic. Go ahead and check them out. Use promo code Andrew. And when you do so, your first time deposit is immediately doubled up to $100. Take advantage of the opportunity. Get daily fantasy at your fingertips, predicting potential successes or failures of players as we do every single week for fantasy football. Until tomorrow, we'll talk about our wide receiver rankings for week 13. Thank you everybody for watching, and I'll see you guys. Peace.